So, let's get into this story. I'm going to kick things off about how this story goes.
Okay.
So, just a brief introduction. You are James Sunderland, as we have said. You go to Silent Hill in order to try and find your wife, Mary, which you have a letter that says that she is waiting for you in your special place. You have a photo of her, and she has died 3 years ago. You think your special place is in Silent Hill, so you go to Silent Hill to try and meet up with Mary. Over the course of this adventure, you meet characters like Angela, you meet Eddie, and Laura, and Maria. All these characters have problems or oddities to them. My thought on the entirety of this plot is that James is in purgatory. He is already dead, and either the characters that he runs into are manifestations of his own mind, or they are other dead people in purgatory that he is meeting throughout his voyage, and he just needs to come to terms with what he did in order to be saved, or whatever the case might be. And there's been various discussions on what this is. That's my take. I'm just curious on what everyone else's take is. And yeah, Silent Hill isn't real, it's purgatory. Shane, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I have some
we'll go on this.
I mean, you're entitled to be wrong, Chris.
Oh,
that's fine.
Okay.
All right. So, wow, where do we even begin with this? So, as we kind of alluded to in the brief history, right, Silent Hill 2 is kind of an outlier in the series in that, or at least in the original series. And by that, I mean mostly the first three. You could loop number 4 in there because canonically it actually is tied into a lot of what happens. But number 2, it's not directly tied to the story of the town such as it is. The story of the town, if you've played the first game or you listened to our episode about it, which if you haven't, you should, is centered around the cult that exists in the town of Silent Hill and has for some time, and what ends up happening with all of that. That's that kind of story. And that gets picked up again in 3, but with 2, it uses the town more as a backdrop more than anything. It's not going directly into, the details of that cult story. It's using it as a backdrop to explore the characters' psyches. And I say that in plural because, and of course, a lot of this is left open-ended for, obvious reasons. The developers kind of want you to either figure some of it out for yourself or have some interpretations of it. And they like to be cagey about it on purpose. But a lot of the things that either devs over time have said in interviews or in social media and just, general consensus of really analyzing the plot, because people have gone real deep into this, is my prevailing belief of kind of how things go in this story is that all of the people, including James, all of the people there are in fact real people, with the exception of Maria. As you play through the game, right, you're playing as James. As Chris said, you initially show up there, you park your car outside of the town at like a rest stop, basically. That's where you start. And your whole impetus, at least as far as you're aware, for coming is that letter that he apparently mysteriously received from his wife who died allegedly 3 years earlier. And of course, how could that happen? How can you receive a letter from a dead person? And so it says, go back to Silent Hill. That was our special place. They had spent time there, specifically at the hotel, which is why eventually that's the last place that you end up at the game. As James journeys through Silent Hill, it is in fact a real town, and the manifestations, and I don't mean that like real as in like our world real, because there's a misconception, by the way, that it's based on a town, Centralia, and that's not true. That was actually the movie. It has nothing to do with the original games. But all of the people that he meets there are in fact real people, and the part of what backs that up, at least in my mind, is if you pay close attention to what happens as James is interacting with these people, there's a couple of things that kind of key this off, right? One big one is that the environment, Silent Hill itself, actually changes based on who you are interacting with. Okay. When you interact with Eddie, many of the occasions, not every single one, because sometimes you'll meet him, like for instance, when he's with Laura, that's kind of a mixed company there. Right. But most of the time when you meet up with Eddie, the environment tends to be more, has a cold feeling to it, like to the point where towards the end you are literally in what looks like a freezer, like a meat locker, inexplicably, actually, in most cases. And that is sort of like how he is experiencing Silent Hill. Like, you are becoming a part of their version of Silent Hill. And that's why also you see, you know, when he's talking about all the people that he's killed, because his issue, right, is that he's been made fun of his whole life. He killed a dog to like lash out about this. And that comes up that he's basically on the lam from the police. Laura's asking him about it when they're sitting there and he's eating pizza at the bowling alley. And he ends up basically killing a bunch of what looks like people in Silent Hill because his test was to come to terms with this shit and like overcome this constant, you know, like beratement and stuff that he's gotten his whole life. And he fails. And so he ends up just killing what are these manifestations of these people that have been making fun of him his whole life. And you see them as people, as dead bodies. You don't see them as monsters. And so that's what he's seeing. And if you notice, none of the other characters ever mention monsters, with the exception of Maria. She is the only one that ever experiences the same monsters that you do, that James does. She's the only one. No one else ever brings it up. When you have conversations, like in your initial conversation with Eddie, James is talking about it, but Eddie never actually acknowledges that there are these monsters wandering around the town ever. And neither does Angela. Nobody else does. Laura doesn't either. They never bring this up. Okay.
Angela totally does.
Where?
You fight a monster. She sees the monster. She tells you the town is dangerous.
Right. She doesn't see the monster, though. That's where I'm getting with that. She doesn't see it the way you do.
She throws a TV on the monster and kicks it.
Where?
When you kill the boss that's in the same room that you save her from.
Right. That's what I'm getting at.
Okay.
She's not seeing the same thing you are. And I'll get to that in a second. So they're never actually seeing the same thing that James is. The town manifests a different version of itself.
Yes.
For every person that is there, because they're all brought to the town to deal with their own personal shit. And so that's Eddie. You've got Laura, the little girl, which inexplicably just runs around the town and is never in any sort of danger. She never seems to be concerned about anything. And that's because she's the only one that is not there to deal with personal demons. She's there. She showed up there because of her relationship with Mary, because they were roommates basically in the hospital. Okay. So she's not actually there to deal with any issues. So there's no threat to her whatsoever. The town doesn't threaten her at all. And in most cases, when you see her, especially one of the first times when she's sitting up on top of a wall and there's just like little chalk doodles on the wall that presumably she drew, the town actually looks fairly normal by most standards. And so that's kind of how she sees things. And so she's not aware of all the heinous shit that's going on otherwise. And then you've got Angela. And one of the things that you can point out that sort of alludes to how she kind of experiences Silent Hill is at the very end, right? When the last time you see her before she walks into the ether is in a burning staircase, right? The conversation that you have with her, you say, James actually says like, it's hot in here. And which is odd because you just came from a series of rooms that were underwater. You were wading through like waist deep water to get to there. And then all of a sudden you're in a room that's on fire. There was no indication of this prior to that. And he's like, it's hot in here. And she's like, oh, this is like, you see it too. It's like, this is how I see it all the time. So to her, Silent Hill is basically always like this. It's always on fire. And that's because of what she did. She killed her father because of his abuse and burned their family house down.
Yeah.
That was her backstory. And so that's her version of Silent Hill. And you're experiencing it with her at that moment. That's not James's version of the town, such as it is. Mm-hmm. The thing with the monster, the boss that you kill in that piston room, is that the way that I kind of view that one, if you hear what Angela says out, so when you're in the hallway before you go into that room, she basically says something to the effect of like, daddy stop or daddy no. Right. And so that's her experiencing the trauma of her father, but she's not seeing it the same way that you are necessarily. Okay. Or even if she is, that might be the only thing that she's really seen. She's probably not seeing the same, manifestations of monsters that James is, because those, for the most part, are specific to his trauma. Right.
Right.
Okay. Are we all following along so far?
No. Yeah. I mean, that's a yes.
Okay. And so Maria, right, she's the only one that's not an actual real person as far as I'm concerned. And that's also why I think that extra content in the other version of the game is total bullshit and is not canonical, because it doesn't make any fucking sense. Maria is essentially the idealized version of your wife, Mary. It's what James wanted her to be, or perhaps what she once was, right? Before she ended up getting sick. She's very assertive. She's very sexual. She's very forward. And so, and it's odd because it's also this weird dichotomy, right? Of like, she's assertive and in some ways confident, but also constantly relies on James to protect her, to the point where she gets pissed at you when she thinks that you've left her.
Yes.
And on at least one occasion. And so it is very much this like confusingly ideal version of his wife that he's kind of like manifested in his head, because she's simultaneously cool and confident and like very assertive, but also I'm, the maiden that needs saving at the same time. Right. And so the reason that I believe that she's the only person that you meet that's not an actual person who's experiencing Silent Hill in their own way is she's also the only one that is directly affected by James's manifestations, specifically Pyramid Head. She gets killed by Pyramid Head at least 3 times in front of you, then inexplicably returns again when you meet up with her later. That in itself, I think, is indicative of the fact that she's not an actual person. But that also just speaks to kind of what Pyramid Head is, right, for James, which is sort of the manifestation of his guilt and it trying to show him over and over again what he did.
Yeah.
And for him to come to terms with it, because you find out, towards the end of the game that he suffocated his wife with a pillow. And in his head, he was justifying it for a while, probably anyway, that it was done out of love, that he was putting her out of her misery because she was so far gone and she was sick and suffering. And then eventually he comes to terms with the fact that like that might be partially true, but it was also a selfish act in that he basically admits to her post-mortem and towards the end of the game that like, I actually did this for me because I just couldn't deal with you anymore, because she became someone who was not his wife. It's implied heavily that, whatever sickness it was that she had, they don't never specify, not only physically disfigured her, but also turned her into a very like bitter person, which was not at all like what she once was,
Mm-hmm.
And so he kind of ended up euthanizing her more for, I think, his own benefit than anything when he really comes down to it. And that's part of what he's grappling with. I've got a lot more to say on it, but I'm going to pause because I've been going on a fucking rant. So.
Kade.
So I did not read a bunch of Reddit threads, and normally I would read a bunch of Reddit threads in preparing for an episode like this, but I wanted to come into it with my interpretation of the plot, because based from playing it twice and then watching some YouTube videos years ago, and I kind of am like right in the middle of both of you. Shane has made some really good points that make me sort of question my interpretation. The main difference is I don't believe he's dead and in purgatory like Chris. I think he's very much alive. I think Silent Hill is very much a real place. And even though it's not directly connected to the story of the other games, 1 or the ones after 2, I think it's an example of, because of the events of 1 or maybe even events that happened before 1, depending how deep into the lore you want to go, Silent Hill has become this place, as Shane was alluding to, that attracts people who are dealing with demons, and then it manifests itself different. It's like this haunted sort of dimensional portal where people come and their psyches get manifested, and then they have to deal with shit. And Even though it's not directly connected to the plot lines in 1 or 3, I viewed Silent Hill as almost like this is set in the universe of Silent Hill. This is just James is just another one of many, many people who come to Silent Hill. And these type of stories are probably happening all the time in Silent Hill. It's a very real place. But the part where I agree with Chris is I previously did not think any of the other characters were real. I thought they were all part of his own manifestation, and they were aspects like shards or aspects of his guilt that had taken on their own narratives. So it's like, okay, she killed her dad, and like I don't think James actually killed his dad, but that's like that. I interpreted it again the second time I played it as like, okay, these are all like archetypes of his psyche. And they all kind of funnel towards the big thing, which is he killed his wife out of selfishness and doesn't want to admit it to himself. That's the big spoiler.
Yeah.
But now that you're talking about it, because I had already believed Silent Hill was a real place that attracted people, and then they had basically like psychological experiences where in their own head, Silent Hill manifested different based on their experiences. I never had noticed those environmental differences that you discussed. So like maybe they are real people. But I was kind of in the middle. I thought Silent Hill was real. James wasn't necessarily physically in purgatory, but everything that you play in the game existed in his head as a psychological manifestation. That's what I originally thought. But you've got me pretty convinced that I could be wrong.
Yeah, and so part of it that kind of goes against the whole this is just in his head or it's a purgatory that he's experiencing is what you mentioned, is that though the plot of Silent Hill 2 is not directly related necessarily to the backstory of the town and the cult and everything like that, it is absolutely a product of it.
Yes.
Because, Alessa Gillespie, right? That was the girl in the first game. She's the one that was born with these like supernatural powers. The cult thought that she was going to birth their god, blah, blah, blah. Her powers are basically what is fueling this town. Her ability to manifest these things grew exponentially to the point where once we get through the timeline, the chronology of Silent Hill, when James and the other people are sort of attracted to it, the town's power, such as it is, has grown so strong that it is, in fact, attracting people with these negative things that they're trying to grapple with. It's like bugs to a lamplight, basically. And that ability that she had to basically create this almost alternate dimension, almost like a pocket dimension in the town of Silent Hill, that's what's creating these things, for these people. So that's really the thing that having, tying it back to sort of the background story of the cult and Alessa and all that stuff, that's really, for me, what kind of pulls it away from the notion that this is just like something that's happening in somebody's head. Like it is there, and the town is actually manifesting these things.
So the reason I have to take pause with anything of the events of Silent Hill 1 when it comes to Silent Hill 2 is that I don't think it's ever mentioned in Silent Hill 2. I think Silent Hill 2 is a standalone product.
It is mentioned, though. It is. Like when you read a lot of like the various like notes or books and other lore objects throughout the game, or like the paintings and things like that, they do allude back to that. Like there are old newspapers that talk about things that happened in the past for the town. There's a thing about like the tourist boat that sunk in the lake. Yes. And there was like 60 or 70 something
67
people that died
in the boat on the lake. Yes.
Right. So like there are things that do kind of tie back to the original storyline.
I still think it's more of a red herring than anything else, because when I'm looking at this game, I'm looking at the NPCs, I'm looking through the voyage of all these characters. I'm looking at James, and the first thing you notice about James is the first entrance into Silent Hill is just abnormal. So first of all, the entire town is gated off, and the only way to get in there is through a gate, and it's a descent. The first place you get to is a cemetery, and that's when you encounter Angela.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you meet her. It's in a cemetery, and it's a great descent. There is no way into the town and even when you get into this car park, there's no way to really get into that car park. Everything is very, very, very abstract. You don't know how any of the other characters got to the town. You don't know how you got to them. Well, you know how I got to, you drove there. But it's like this special place, and James is just like not shocked at all. There's no feeling towards the oddities that James is displaying, towards that this entire town is barricaded off. Now, that could be an emotional thing, but like, it's not odd to him. Now, you could.
But it is, though.
It's not.
He brings it up. He asks at least one or two of the people that he meets, like, what the hell is going on here? Like, why do you know what's happening? Like, he specifically asks.
But I think that's like in terms of the monsters and the actual environment that he's encountering. It's not in terms of everything being blocked off in terms of the town. It's not in terms of him sticking his hand down a toilet without even thinking about it, or into a wall, or jumping down caverns that can continuously descend over and over and over again. When you have walls that just have doors that are upside down and just in odd places, and he doesn't even mention it, come to think of it, or anything. It's just like, yeah, I'm going to jump down this hole.
Well, when those things specifically, when those occur, that's towards the very late game. And at that point, you could argue that he's experienced so much of this otherworldly shit that at that point, he's just like taking it at face value. He's just like, okay, fuck it. I don't understand exactly what's going on here, but I have to push forward.
I just think
like it's more of like a fight or flight thing at that point.
I'm looking at everything that's happening, though, and he seems so disconnected from things. So in terms of all the characters, too, you bring up Laura, and one of the big things about Laura, this is why I think Laura is dead, is Laura was a patient with Mary. Mm-hmm. Now, in James's mind, Mary died 3 years ago. And at the end of the game, you see the letter that Laura gives you and says, well, she died a week ago because I'm about to turn 8 like this week. And this says you're turning 8 next week. Why can't have Laura died a week after Mary did? They're both patients in a hospital. You don't know why Laura was in the hospital, but you knew she was in a hospital.
Sure.
You very much know that she was there. And this is a hospital for very sick people that they were patients with. You know Mary was dying. You know that James killed Mary. So you look at all the other characters and you get to a point where you go to the cemetery again, that's in the basement of the Historical Society, and you have 3 tombs. Mm-hmm. 3 tombs for the 3 people I believe are all in purgatory, which is Eddie, Angela, and James. They all have graves. They're all dug, and James goes into his grave to fight his demons. Now, of all the characters that fight their demons, James is the only one that really comes to terms with it. Angela comes close. Eddie obviously doesn't. He fails. But then you have Laura. Laura's not in purgatory because Laura doesn't see any of the shit that they do. Laura's more of a guide to get James out. Maria is Mary, essentially in purgatory. But she's not really. That's the more complicated part.
Yeah.
When it comes to it, all these characters can theoretically be dead. There's nothing to say that Silent Hill isn't purgatory. Even when you look at the journey from the Historical Society to the lighthouse, that's like the voyage of the River Styx.
You make a good point about the 3 characters that are in. You're basically saying it's not necessarily all in James's head because the other 2 characters are real, but they're also dead and in purgatory, and they just sort of interact each other. So
yes,
that's interesting.
They show you James is dead in the apartments. They show you James in front of a TV with his brains blown out. In fact, all the characters, all the character models that are dead in the city are James.
All of them, which we can get into miscellaneous. I have some notes for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, we could go back and forth on this because they did leave a lot of this open-ended on purpose.
Absolutely.
I am of the personal opinion that I don't think it is a purgatory. Like, they've established the canon of Silent Hill pretty well now, to the point where I think that it is the town itself that is manifesting this stuff and attracting these people to try to either deal with their, in a very sort of almost Saw kind of way, but far less gory, in that like they're trying to deal with their demons. And if they fail, then they fail and they fucking are, killed or consumed by the town's evil, essentially. But as far as the rest of the plot goes, so like we said, you find out, right, that James ultimately killed his wife. And the interesting thing, and I like that you pointed this out, again, this is another miscellaneous thing, but it kind of works here, is you never actually see it, but it has actually been confirmed by a member of Team Silent that James had the body of his wife in the backseat of his car this entire time, that she was there from moment 1. And the reason that he initially came to Silent Hill was to commit suicide. He was coming there and he was bringing the body of his wife and he was going to drive into the lake with her because that was their special place. And he couldn't deal with the grief of what he did. And so that was his plan. And that is, of course, one of the endings that you can get depending on some of the things that you do in the game. That is not to suggest that it is the canonical ending, because it is not. There is no actual canonical ending as far as Team Silent is concerned. They consider any of them to be valid, perhaps with the exception of the joke endings, of course.
Right.
But that was his original intention. And then from there, you know, you kind of, it might diverge depending on what you do. The interesting thing that I found, and I don't know if you guys noticed this as well, I guess it depends on what ending you got, I think. One of the things that is very interesting is how they handle that letter in the game for a number of reasons. So at the very beginning, you're given what you are being told is the entirety of the letter. It's a pretty short letter, actually, right? It's basically just saying like, James, I'm waiting for you. I'm at Silent Hill. It's our special place. And so he takes that at face value and goes there. One thing that is very easy to miss, but is brilliant and is just there to fuck with the player's head, is over the course of the game, once you get to a certain point, that letter in your inventory changes. It will have the text of the letter if you like inspect the object. And then after a certain point in the game, the letter becomes blank. And then if I'm not mistaken, I believe it actually disappears, but at the very least, it definitely goes blank. And that's like basically James coming to terms with, you know, the whole situation. But the thing that I found very compelling is that what you think is the entirety of the letter at the beginning is not. It's a much longer letter. And that gets read out by Mary during one of the endings. So if you get the ending where you kind of walk off with Laura, and presumably you've sort of like come to terms with everything and you leave Silent Hill and Laura is there with you now, Mary reads out the entirety of the letter, and the things that James and the player took to mean like, I'm currently in Silent Hill, like I'm here, come find me, blah, 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 didn't mean that at all. It's actually a really fucking heartbreaking letter.
Yes.
Like she's writing it with the intention of giving it to him after she's gone. And it's basically saying that he was a fucking dick the whole time that she was sick, that he didn't come visit her nearly as often as he should have. And the thing about I'm waiting for you, she was talking about that. She's like, I'm here at the hospital and I'm waiting for you, but you never come.
Mm-hmm.
And then she talks about, no, it's very clear. That's what she's saying. And then she talks about Laura and how she has to basically apologize for James to Laura, because Laura, even as an 8-year-old girl, sees it, that he's a shitlord. And like, she basically has to be like, well, you know, and apologize for him. He's like, well, he's a little rough around the edges, but he's actually a decent guy, and just give him a chance. And so that's the entirety of the letter. So it's like almost as if James disassociated from this and really only read like the first part of it. And in him like not wanting to come to terms with the reality of the situation, it's almost as if he was in this like fever dream of like, oh, I got a letter from my dead wife, which he did actually, because the nurse told it, like was told specifically to give him that letter after Mary passed. So he did actually get a letter from his dead wife. That is technically true. But he only really like pays attention to the first part and misconstrues that to mean I need to go to Silent Hill because, wow, maybe my wife's alive. Except that's not actually what the letter was saying at all.
Do the letters change depending on the endings?
Maybe.
Because that's not what I got from the letter at all. Before I kick it over to Kate.
What ending did you get?
I got the leave ending.
Yeah. When he leaves with Laura?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I got too. And if you pay attention to what she's saying, that's what she's saying.
That's part of what she's saying. But there's also the part where she says, I'm sorry for what I did to you, what I did to us, which directly ties into the memories that James has when you go to the long corridor before the final boss. When you listen to the entirety of the conversation between James and Mary, where you get the entire feeling that the entire time that Mary also feels guilt for what she did to James, because Mary is constantly berating James for not being like perfect, which is what you also get from Maria, which you experience when Maria catches up with you after you leave her behind for a bit, when she says, you were supposed to take care of me, you were supposed to protect me, and all the down talking that Maria does to James in general.
Right.
That's why there's a split to it. Yeah, I'm waiting for you to come back, but I'm waiting for you to come back because I was such a bitch. It's not that like, yeah, James is a giant douche nozzle. It's, I told you to get the fuck away from me. you went away and now I'm like butthurt about it. So yeah, there's a little bit of both.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, that is a good point. I mean, I guess what I should say is that there's definitely fault on both sides. Like nobody is innocent in this situation, right?
No.
Yeah. No, you're no,
Well,
that is a good point.
I would say that she's only a bitch because she's sick.
Sure.
No, I agree with that. Like there's a lot going on there. Yeah.
It's interesting because like it's making me think, about my own interpretation.
The other interesting thing about it is like what Chris pointed out with the time lapse, right? Where he thinks at the beginning, he's telling everybody that he meets basically that he's like, yeah, my wife died like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
In his mind, she died 3 years ago because she was essentially dead to him 3 years ago.
When she got the disease.
Because that's when
That
she got
explains
sick.
the weak thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's when she
Yeah.
got sick. And so as far as he's concerned, the wife that he knew was dead to him 3 years ago. And he's so disassociated from what really is going on that he has convinced himself that his wife has been dead, actually dead for 3 years. When in reality, Laura brings that up where it's been like, what, a week or something?
Right.
Yeah.
And like I still hold my position that Laura is dead because everyone's in purgatory. But I still agree with your perspective that she died to him when she got the disease, because I think that's pretty much made implicitly clear in the boss version of the final boss for the In Water ending.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like, oh, when I got sick 3 years ago, that's when like and then that's pointed out that, oh, she got sick 3 years ago in James's mind. And that's when she technically died to him, because it lines up.
Yeah.
So it is made clear that, yeah, that is something that happened, that her death in James's mind, at least at the beginning of the game, is when she became sick and she became hospitalized as opposed to actually physically dying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know. I want to leave open space for Kade to jump in if he's got something, because I wanted to start talking about some of the symbolism as well.
All I'd say to that is making me think. I interpreted that ending in particular as like a mix. I didn't necessarily think that James was a douche nozzle. I interpreted it more as like, life sucks. This is one of those situations where, yeah, she was a bitch, but because she was sick and she was dying.
Mm-hmm.
He killed her, but that's because his wife turned into a bitch, and he could it's one of those like, I see the humanity, or I understand why these characters. And it's sort of not their fault because they got exposed to like extremely dark circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I viewed it more as just like, yeah, dude, it's a heavy world out there, and we're tackling heavy topics, and this shit happens, right? Grief and darkness, it's all part of the human experience. And I didn't walk away, I walked away thinking like, he's not, there's no justification for murder, right? But you understand why he did it, and you understand why she was a bitch. And it's just like, oh, they're humans.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in some cases, those sort of extreme circumstances will bring out the best in people. And then sometimes it'll bring out the absolute worst.
In Silent Hill, it was like attracts the worst. Yeah.
Yeah. In James and Mary's case, it brought the worst out of both of them, I think.
Yeah, more so James, because he actually killed her.
Yeah.
It's pretty fucked up. Let's be real. By the way, just in case anyone's wondering, murder's bad, okay?
There's, no matter how bad your wife is, there's no justification in murdering her.
Yes.
Just pointing that out.
For legal reasons, we have to say that.
Just because we understand a perspective does not mean we agree with it.
Right. Yeah. So I guess a little bit about the symbolism, because honestly, that's another big thing that, like I said, I didn't necessarily pick up on a lot of this in the initial playthrough. I mean, fuck, man, it was like 2001, 2002. So I was like, what, 14, 15 or something.
Right.
So at the time I was just like, yeah, it's fucking cool. It's dark and scary and I like it.
Game.
But like, I knew that there was something more to it. I just couldn't really put my finger on it, I guess. But now, having spent the last, and oh God, 20 something years, holy shit, kind of thinking it over and really diving deeper into it, the symbolism in just that, I guess that's the thing, is like a lot of games and a lot of media lean on a symbolism to varying degrees, right? But I think one of the things that stands out so well here is that damn near almost everything has a purpose in this game. It's not, and I think that's one of the things that's lacking from a lot of media, but specifically
Open world games,
horror games. Yeah. Even later games in the Silent Hill series, because they lost the fucking plot like along the way, to where a lot of them are just it's scary, so we're just gonna make something look scary for the sake of being scary, and that's it. And there's no deeper purpose or meaning to it. And here, that's not the case. Everything that's here, there is a reason behind it. And so we were talking earlier about how the design behind a lot of the creatures that you come across, and a lot of that is very purposeful. So a lot of it, as we kind of alluded to, is like uncomfortably sexual in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's done on purpose, because part of that, especially with the nurses, and they're a little bit of a twofer there, right? Because they're representative of the time that he spent and they spent collectively in the hospital when she was sick. But it's also a very in your face sort of representation of James's like repressed sexuality and his frustration with his wife being ill and him basically having no real, sexual outlet.
He's like a monk.
Right.
Yeah.
And so having these attractive nurses or whatever, that's kind of a manifestation of that. And they're very overtly sexual. And there's other things that you come across earlier in the game, too, like the mannequin creatures where it's just 4 legs, with 2 legs stacked on top of 2 other legs. And they're even like oddly sexual in a way, because almost all of the creatures, with the exception of Pyramid Head, for a reason, were designed in a feminine sort of fashion on purpose. Even the creeper ones towards the beginning, if you notice, they're a little bit more slender in build and things like that. And that's done on purpose, because these are manifestations of James' sort of psyche. A lot of that gets factored into how these things are represented in Silent Hill to him.
They all have lips.
Right. And of course, the exception to that being Pyramid Head, because as we said earlier, that's really his guilt. And that is the driving force behind trying to get him to own up to, what he did and actually face the situation. It's also why Pyramid Head ends up killing other creatures even that, James sees, because it's trying to clear away these delusions that he's having to just make him see the reason that he's there and the thing he's supposed to confront.
So I have a question about enemy placement. If everything, in your perspective, everything makes sense. The nurses are not in this game for very long.
Mm-hmm.
They're very brief. In fact, towards the end of the games, what you find is mostly the walkers or whatever you want to call them, right?
Yeah.
After you defeat, I guess it's called the abstract father or perfect father, depending on the translation you get, with Angela, these things still show up in the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
Why are those things in there if that's part of Angela's world? And what are they supposed to represent?
Well, so again, like you were saying, I think he's seeing something different than what Angela was seeing, right, in that particular instance. I could be wrong about that, because one of the interpretations of that like abstract father or whatever, if you look closely at it, it is very abstract, but the heavy implication there
looks like 2 people fucking.
It's 2 people having sex on a bed, on a platform, essentially. And so that kind of implies what was going on with her father's situation. Right. So maybe it is that's what she's seeing. But like I said, maybe that's the only one that she sees. I don't know. One thing that I did come across that was interesting with that, something somebody pointed out that even I didn't really notice, is that I think it's actually after that encounter, just about everything else that you see for the rest of the game, with, of course, the exception of Pyramid Head, has that sort of, it has those, that mouth on it, like that creature has, because they make it's very prominent on the front of it, right?
Right. And
there's some sort of like transition there where prior to that, none of the creatures that you came across had mouths, which is an interesting thing to note.
You mean after the father, the mannequins get mouths?
No. I mean, like, I think most of what you encounter is like smaller versions of that abstract father or whatever. But the point is like mouths are not present like at all until that point. And the interpretation that I think that somebody had got on that, and I'm not saying this is truth or whatever, was that it was like supposed to be a representation of his like disgust with what Mary ended up looking like and like what she had turned into.
Mm-hmm.
Just an interesting take on it.
Because the first boss that has a mouth on it are the bosses in those cages upside down, the one that Laura locks you into. Those are the first ones that have mouths.
Did they? I actually don't remember.
Yeah, because it focuses on the lips. That's the first thing it focuses on before you start fighting them.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a complicated game.
I wanted to bring up, back to Pyramid, when you talked about Pyramid Head, another issue people have disagreed online that I looked into a little bit prior to preparing for this episode and in the past is when Pyramid Head kills enemies, back to this sort of sexual theme, there's a few scenes where he looks like he's killing enemies attached with like the big R word, right? The word you don't want to say. And Team Silent, from what I understand, has officially said that's not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not what's going on. Now, I thought like maybe they said that in retrospect because it's like a bad thing. Things were different back then. But I viewed it as either one, he was forcing himself on his wife when she didn't want it out of sexual frustration, representation of that, or he was cheating on her.
Yeah, one or the other. They don't say a lot about either. They don't say a lot about that if he actually did cheat on her. That's never really it's never really stated or even really suggested. That's left up heavily into interpretation, depending on what you.
Well, that's what I interpreted from all like the sexuality, right? It's not that he was repressed, as Shane was saying, but he acted on it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with Team Silent saying retrospectively, because I've heard this as well, that they said that, Pyramid Head wasn't raping the other monsters, that he was more smothering them or killing them.
Yes.
And an allusion to what James did. But it's very sexual what Pyramid Head is doing to them.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think the fact that all three of us, and I'll count four because my friend, when we played this game, we all thought the same thing.
Yeah.
We all came to this conclusion. So whether or not it was intentional or not, like it's pretty clear that something is going on there, or they did something that got very misinterpreted, one or the other. But I think that there is definitely something to it. Now, whether or not it's straight up sexual thing or not, I guess, they've, like you said, like Masahiro Ito officially denied this on Twitter a while back.
But the sexuality in general is undeniable. And I have a suspicion that it was intentional. And then sort of later it was like, we need to walk this back PR wise.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
That's possible. Yeah.
Well, they could be playing games with you like a Kojima thing or something. Like, no, that's not really what I meant.
True, I guess.
You don't know. I mean, these people who are artistically minded and writing, I don't know what a lot of them are thinking and how much they put into their art, especially if they're being cagey and kind of shielded about what things may mean or may not mean. They might have fun toying with people and just saying like, well, this is what really happened. And they probably either exactly knew what they were talking about at the time or had no idea what they were talking about at the time, either or, and they're just having fun fucking with us for the remainder of time. I mean, there's always that possibility.
Yeah.
You can't discount that, because when you have a bunch of people who constantly harass you on Twitter, because this is what happens in social media, and you've seen this, where, people just be like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to say something. And people are just going to take it as canon and they'll leave me alone.
Right.
I think there's an aspect to that as well.
I wonder if there's also sort of like, obviously the game is made by a team. And I don't have any examples specific to this game, but I have read examples where different team members of a game would be talking about a plot or something that's more vague. And different team members will have different interpretations, and they'll kind of put subtle hints of their own interpretation into the game.
Oh, sure.
Not everything makes it through, like, the director's QA, whatever. So maybe like the overt sexuality wasn't necessarily intentional by the director, right? Like you have some, I don't know how to, like, there's some weird sexual stuff in Disney movies that I don't think the director did on purpose, that maybe was snuck in by an animator or something. Like, I don't know. Like, it's possible that someone like took that interpretation of Pyramid Head, maybe an animator or something, and when Ito saw it, it was like, yeah, he's smothering them. I mean, I don't know. To me, it's so obvious. I'm trying to think of a way where it's like not intentional, but
especially when you have the sexy nurses right after you encounter Pyramid Head.
Yes,
it's like, really?
I just don't believe him. I don't believe him when he says it wasn't intentional.
No,
I just don't.
Well, it's strange because like if you look at that that scene, because we're all talking about the same exact thing, is like there could have been so many different ways. I mean, Pyramid Head carries around the great knife, a big motherfucking
knife.
buster sword. Like, why does he not just slice them up with that or something? Like the manner in which he's doing it is very suggestive, right? You know, I actually kind of like the possible interpretation that it's supposed to be like indicative of the method in which James ends up killing his wife, that maybe it's sort of like a struggle. It's showing the struggle of him like smothering her to death. That's an interesting take. But
that's good, because you could argue say like she would trust him enough to allow him in like an intimate position, right? And then he could lure her in and kill her that way,
right?
Yeah, but we know that's not what happened.
I know.
Well, true.
We're just trying to defend the dude because he lied on Twitter.
Fucking Twitter.
Well, and so actually not at all related to, well, actually it is the plot, but it's more of just a fun little thing that I had never even noticed either. But evidently, because since we're talking about the wife murder and all, when you first pick up the radio at the very beginning of the game, evidently, if you like listen really close, Mary actually says, "Why did you kill me?"
Really? I did not know that.
Over the radio. Yeah. But it's like, it's very obscured and like obfuscated. So it's hard to pick up because like I said, I never noticed it, but evidently that is there. And then it goes to like static.
Wow. I didn't know that. This game.
There's so much to it. Also, just real quick, you had said earlier, like that scene in that apartment room was the first time that you come across Pyramid Head.
It's not.
It's not. And it's fucking fantastic how you do, because it's so fucking ominous. And this is what I love about it. This is that restraint. This is what I love about well done horror, is restraint. It cannot be overstated. And whether it's music, because a lot of times that gets overdone, where they just try to throw it in your face with big balls or whatever, but also with these sort of elements, because when you're walking down one of the hallways in that first apartment building, right, it's very dark. Then all of a sudden there's this like faint red glow that you start to see at the end of the hallway, and you don't know what it is. And then the closer you get to it, you see that the hallway is barred off, so you can't continue. But you very quickly see that there is a figure standing there, stock still. And you're like, what the hell is that? And the closer you get, you find out that is Pyramid Head. And he's just standing there, just looming at you with no explanation, no big introduction. It's actually, I don't even think there's music playing at that point.
No
it's
music.
Dead silent. Yep. It's such a good introduction.
He's not even like perfectly clear either. It's just, you have to shine the,
nope.
It's just kind of like almost static, but not static. It's a fantastic introduction to such what's ultimately like essentially the real final boss, because no one gives a shit about the actual final boss. Yeah, that's so good.
And I know I don't want to keep belaboring this because we could go on forever, I think. But the other really cool thing about, and again, this is that attention to detail, James is never capable of actually damaging Pyramid Head at all whatsoever. You think you are, but you're not. You can straight up kill all of the other monsters that you encounter. But anytime you try to attack Pyramid Head, it doesn't actually do any damage to him. And you don't actually defeat Pyramid Head when you fight him at the end at all. You basically just run out the clock on him, and then Pyramid Head offs himself in sort of a symbolic representation of like James finally accepting his guilt for what he's done. And now Pyramid Head's purpose is fulfilled. And so it, takes itself out with its own spear. So at no point is James capable of just forcibly removing his guilt from the equation.
Yeah. Like it's him overcoming his own demons and coming to the acceptance of what he's done and what his fate will be.
Mm-hmm. This game's good, guys. I don't know if you picked up on that yet.
Do we really want to get into the characters? Because I know we've been prattling on about the plot. I know we've kind of touched on them a little bit.
I mean, I feel like I went off on a lot of details on that already.
I think you did. I don't know. I think we've covered most of the parts. I know my take is not a popular one because I've tried to find someone who agrees with me. I have not found it, by the way. But I think Shane made a really good point in that this is open, and the way this plot is written is so open to interpretation that if you find something and you can reasonably explain to it within the confines of the actual plot. There's nothing really there to tell you that you're right or wrong. It's all up to you to see how you can puzzle this thing together. And as long as it makes sense to you, as long as you're getting something out of it, then, oh, boo, scary game. I think that's what the developers were going for. And there's no denying they did a fantastic job, because as long as everyone agrees on the core fundamentals of this game's plot, what it means and how it continues beyond itself is exactly a great example of great media. It's a great example of interactive media, because there's a lot of things in this game you just cannot do through any other media other than a video game, than being interactive and making these decisions. That's the brilliance of a game like this. And not many games pull this off. And to my knowledge, at least, I'm not going to say to my knowledge, but in my experiences, this is the first game I ever played that really did that. That's a special thing in terms of video games.
Yeah. And also, I mean, at least from my own personal experience, this was the first game really that had this much depth to it, that had this many layers, to the point where I dove really deep into like the lore and all that stuff, and wanting to know more about like what the intention was and the symbolism and all of that. Like up until this point, I think nothing comes to mind anyway that I had played or experienced prior to this game that did as much as this game does. It's a big reason why I'm such a fucking giant unapologetic fanboy of it to this day. It's just because of everything that they did with this game's story. I think everybody should experience this, whether you like horror games or not.
Yeah. Kate, any closing thoughts on the plot?
You should play Alan Wake and you should play Control.
Agreed.
Because
and Spec Ops: The Line.
No, you should not play that.
Fuck you.
Actually, I never played it.
Maybe Evil Within, I guess.
But I think everything you said about Silent Hill and the layers and the depth, I think that this game inspired other games, right? And I think Alan Wake is obvious. Even the fog in Alan Wake, right? The fog has inspired lots of other games.
Mm-hmm.
But Alan Wake and Control do the same things. I would say is close to as good, if not better. They're more modern, obviously, and they have the power of hindsight and learning from Silent Hill 2. But I agree. It strikes this magical middle ground where, as Chris said, as long as enough stuff is concrete that everyone can agree on some things, then it gives you this sort of fun middle ground where people can have conversations like we just had and talk about the details and sort of say my theory versus your theory. Here's my evidence in the game. And I think very few games have done that, as you said. I can't remember a game earlier that I went to the internet and dove deep into reading about the plot of this game and what I missed. There were some games that were contemporary, like the Legacy of Kain series. I spent a lot of time reading about that plot. But less for different reasons. It wasn't psychological. It involved time travel, which time travel gets wonky. Yeah, I can't think of one previously, and I mean plot in the sense of world building and layers, and not just outright exposition. Obviously, there's lots of RPGs that had plots with lots of characters and development. I mean this like sort of style of storytelling. Not only is it one of the earliest, if not the earliest to my memory, but to this day, it competes with any other games that are trying this and still holds up, which sort of skips to the next section or the end section. The only thing I wanted to say, I guess you mentioned about Team Silent officially confirming that her body's in the trunk.
Loosely.
Related to the plot.
Like one of them, yeah.
Shane said it, I believe.
Yeah.
I watched a couple of boundary break videos because I was like, in preparation for this, I wanted to see if there was anything like secrets that were found out of bounds later that I had missed over the years. And people checked that. And even though Team Silent has said that her body, unfortunately, is not modeled nor in the car.
True.
When you look in with camera hacks. But we're talking about a generation where they were maximizing every little bit of horsepower. They're not going to necessarily waste that polygon and texture memory on a body no one's ever going to see for a plot detail. But I was really hoping that her body would actually be there. It was like the first thing he did on this video. It's like, everyone keeps asking me to see if the body's in the trunk. See if the body's in the trunk. Fortunately not. Would have been cool though.
Yeah, because they say it's in the back seat or the passenger seat, even though it's confirmed in the game that it's not the passenger seat if you go to the passenger side. But
right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's also there's there's an interesting take on that too, because the backseat versus trunk thing is that apparently, and again, I don't think it's 100% one way or the other, but the general consensus seems to be that it's actually the back seat, because the trunk is more of like an American notion. And yeah. And also, I didn't know this, but I found it in preparation for this, and I'm sure somebody could dive into it deeper because I didn't go too far down this particular rabbit hole. But evidently, this is a known practice called shinju, where it is literally the practice of killing someone out of love and then offing yourself while bringing the corpse along.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Like, apparently that's actually a thing.
Yeah, that is yes.
Apparently that's kind of what's going on here. So I'm learning something new about this game, like 20 some odd years later.
I still think there's a lot of elements too. You guys won't shut up about it, so we'll just confirm something.
I mean, maybe.
We'll never know because we're not them, and we weren't part of that development team. So
the one last thing, we talked about James's body being like a bunch of the deceased bodies.
Yeah.
The only other thing I really saw in that Boundary Break videos that I watched, some interesting things with some of the puzzles and sort of the game mechanics and graphics. Like reflections are literally just, they actually model the room in James as a mirror version. There's not like a reflection. They just like double and flip the screen, and there's actually two Jameses running around. But if obviously a lot of the bodies you find that are James, where the camera angles work and you don't have a ton of freedom with the camera, you can't quite tell. It's more vague. But if you swing the camera around with body hacks, it is clearly James's face texture on like all these bodies. So that's confirmed.
The other one that's not confirmed is the opening FMV, the very first one, is allegedly that James isn't looking at himself, he's looking at you.
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
I've heard that, yeah.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, do you think it's more of just a thematic connection in like a Easter egg or an ode to the original game? But the original Silent Hill, you enter Silent Hill driving on a car and you stop. This, I think, lends to the fact that Silent Hill might be an actual place, but you could also argue that Purgatory manifests similar for everybody. But James, like, you come in on a car, you don't almost hit somebody, but you drive into Silent Hill, and it like the beginning starts with the person driving into Silent Hill. Is that just like a thematic thing, or do you think it has more of a connection?
It's just something.
Yeah, I think it's more of just a thematic thing that they kind of just go with, because that happens a lot in future iterations of the game as well, and also the movie, but that's a whole other thing. So,
Hooray, movies.
Yeah.
So if you've stuck with us through this just absolutely laborious discussion, a great discussion. I had a great time. I could keep going. I'm sure we all could. We got to get to the end at some point. I think this is the best point that we can. So we're going to talk about whether or not this game is held up today. Kate has the final word as our guest. I am going to kick this one off and then turn it over to Shane. And I think the answer is obvious on this one. Yeah, it's held up. I would just say, like, if you're going to play this game, though, your best bet is to play the PS2 version on the PS2 or the Xbox version on the Xbox. And you can play the PS2 version on your PS3 as well. You know, that's fine. But the other versions graphically, I mean, that's what's going to pull you out of the game, in a game that is so dependent on immersion, on a game that depends on you paying so much attention to detail, to everything. You need to have like a tried and true experience on this game. So if you try to go and play this game on anything other than the original hardware it was intended for, you're not going to probably get the experience that was intended to be had. So absolutely, I think you've heard over the discussion that we definitely think this game holds up for a myriad of reasons. But if you're going to do so, you need to make sure that there is nothing present that's going to pull you out of the game in such a fashion that is just going to potentially ruin your experience, especially for a version 1. Yes, holds up 100%, but find a way to play it. Shane?
Yeah, I'm going to just keep mine pretty succinct and just say, of course, yes, this game is fucking phenomenal and you need to play it if you haven't already. And if you have, you should go back and play it again because it's fantastic. You know, some minor issues with some of the gameplay decisions aside, as we kind of brought up in the beginning, that's really the only nitpick that I can really come up with. But even then, I think it serves the overall experience in a meaningful way. I am definitely of the mind that, and I don't normally do this. If you listen to the show enough, you know that like I am totally okay with just emulating anything that I can because I'm cheap and also I just like things digitally. But in this particular instance, because of the experience of just the game as a whole, if you can, I highly recommend playing on original hardware with a CRT. I know it's definitely fine on an LCD. This is probably one of the only times you're going to hear me say this, honestly. But if you can play it on a old school CRT with a PS2 or I guess an Xbox, then definitely do it that way. And when you do it, make sure you do what I did when I was younger and turn all of the lights out and just have that warm glow of the TV be your only light, and hopefully, be alone in a room by yourself with no distractions and really get immersed in it, because that is the best way to experience this game, like without a question.
Thank you for keeping it succinct, Kate.
Hey, that's succinct for me.
I'm going to say you're both wrong.
Oh,
obviously the game.
How dare you?
The game is worth your time today, but the best way to play it, and I'm not saying the most practical way, I'm saying the best way to play it is to get the enhanced edition with all of the fan community mods that have basically retroactively gone back and used the original PS2 version as a reference to try to get you that experience on modern hardware. You get the 60 FPS, you get the 4K, and then on top of that, you turn your lights off, but you buy a Philips Hue bridge, you deck your whole room out with LED lights, sync them to your computer screen, which makes your whole room match the ambience and lighting of the damn game. And then you smoke some weed and get
there you go,
close to panic attack high, and then you play Silent Hill 2. That's my official recommendation.
But you can play it otherwise, right?
I mean, it's hard to argue. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just joking. Luckily, I'm very fortunate. I have a pretty cool lighting setup. It's really not that bad. It is a little pricey, but you can get this cool device called the Philips Hue Bridge, and you can buy as many lights. It's modular as you want.
Not sponsored.
And it comes with native software, like it's just free, that you can say like, hey, this light is on the top right-hand side of my room. This light's on the bottom left. Sync it to that part of my screen. And then your whole room will match the ambience and the lighting of whatever game you're playing. And for a game like Silent Hill 2, some games it's kind of like a nice, like whatever, like icing on the cake. And some games it really does make the experience different. And for Silent Hill 2, I can confirm, I did not play the whole game. I played about an hour and a half that way before I gave up and just watched the rest in preparation for this. But it was awesome. It was awesome.
Nice.
All right. So I guess this carries us to the end of this episode. So, Cade, why don't you let us know where we can find you on the internet? And thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We had a great time, but I think the people need to know where they can find Gaming Memories Podcast and all the things you do.
Spoiler alert, if you Google Gaming Memories Podcast, you'll find some places to go. Yeah, it's a Gaming Memories Podcast. I interview people like Chris and Shane and other creatives about the favorite games that they enjoyed growing up. I also have a few episodes with Chris about gaming history. Yeah, Gaming Memories Podcast, Instagram, TikTok, whatever regular podcast places you can find me.
Fantastic. And as far as we are concerned, if you're listening to this, then of course that means you found us. So, hey, how you doing? Welcome. We're glad that you, hopefully you enjoyed this one. This is a behemoth of an episode. I don't think we've had an episode this long since the very early days of the show. And that's when we were just rambling about random shit. But we're glad that you stuck it out with us. If you're new to the show, then there are some ways that you can interact with us beyond just listening, and we make that easy for you to find. All you got to do is head over to Linktree/Retro Hangover, and there you will find all of the RHP related things, whether that's our social media accounts or perhaps our YouTube channel or the Twitch streams, or if you want to support the show in a more concrete ducat sort of fashion, you can do that through the Patreon or perhaps the merch store if you want to pick up some sweet swag. So Chris, would you kind of tell the fine people about Twitch and what we do over there?
So if you head over to twitch.tv/retro hangover, you can find us streaming things at Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time US, and we'll play games of some kind. You might be surprised, maybe not, but there's only one way to find out, and that is going to twitch.tv/retrohangover and hitting the follow button. And we hope to see you there. And we'll be playing games, and you can maybe tell us even how to play them at twitch.tv/retrohangover. We'll even pretend to be happy.
Yeah.
Well, we are happy. We're happy if you go there and follow us. We're not going to beg you for money either. So there's that.
That is true. We haven't even turned on Twitch donations or anything. I don't know. Whatever. Fuck it. Yeah. But at any rate, I suppose that's it for us. So until next time.
Play with your, I really want to fuck those 4-legged mannequin joysticks.